There was quite a bit to unpack for the final episode of ReZero, so much so that I couldn't even fit it all into a single video. A lot of the events from the final Witches' Tea Party were streamlined for the sake of getting to a reasonable point to end the season. But by doing that, we missed out on a lot of the interesting interactions from each of the witches, plus a very significant plot point about Satella that wasn't included in the anime. So let's take a look at this and more and see what exactly the finale didn't include from the novels. Also, since a lot of you have been asking, if you're looking for a place to read the novels, then you can continue the story by using Bookwalker. Since we've partnered together, you can use code Aninews to get $5 off your first ebook purchase today. That way you can get a discount and continue the ReZero story from Volume 13. So if you're interested, then the link to that will be down in the description below. Now, let's begin. Episode 38, The Sounds That Make You Want to Cry, covering chapters 1 to 2 of Volume 13 of the light novel. The Witch of Envy's sudden appearance was certainly something surprising, but what Subaru found to be even more surprising was the lack of action from any of the other witches. He always believed that the other 6, if together, would be able to resist her. Yet, not a single one made a move to try to avenge themselves. They simply stood in place as the Witch of Envy made her approach. Now, unlike in the anime, the first person to do anything was actually Minerva, which was pretty shocking considering that Minerva was the weakest witch out of all of them. Unlike the others, she simply isn't capable of directly attacking anyone. Her physical attacks have and always will end up turning into healing, so combat wasn't really Minerva's strong point. That, however, didn't stop her from asking if this was the Envy that she knew. Minerva wanted to know if the shadow standing in front of her could be trusted, but it never answered. Instead, the Witch of Envy just stood there as if completely defenseless. It made Subaru wonder even more why the 6 witches with all their authorities, power, and magic didn't just try to kill her right there. Surely they must be holding some sort of grudge against the one who ended their lives. But that was a question to which only Echidna could answer. She said that if the 6 of them were to gang up and somehow manage to beat Envy, then that would present an opportunity for Sekhmet or Typhon. You see, attacking Envy would also mean to expose your back to the others. And if Echidna was to expose her back to Sekhmet or Typhon, then the odds of her surviving at the end were honestly not very good. That wasn't all there was to it, though. There was an even more important additional factor that went to make the witches hesitate, one that wasn't even implied in the anime. Because of its level of significance, it leads me to believe that it's information that will likely come up later. So if you don't want to know what it is, then feel free to skip ahead to the following timestamp. But anyway, it was after Echidna's answer that Daphne and Carmilla chimed in to elaborate. Yes, the witches did hold a grudge against Envy. That much was an undeniable fact. This, however, was a very different situation. You see, Carmilla and the others didn't have a grudge against the girl standing in front of them. At least, they didn't think so. According to Daphne, whether they'd attack or not was dependent on whether the girl in front of them was Satella or Envy. And if they didn't know who it was, then they would just do nothing at all. So that in its own right was very interesting to know. But what was even more interesting was the fact that Daphne ended her statement by saying that this was something that a sage candidate should have known. A statement that probably shouldn't have been said at all. Reason being that the moment she did, Sekhmet began to scold her. This wasn't something that Subaru was supposed to know yet, and apparently neither were we. In any case, the essence of what they were trying to say was that they weren't mad at Satella. They only held a grudge towards the Witch of Envy. Don't get me wrong though, Satella and the Witch of Envy are in fact the same person. That was how the world remembered them. But what wasn't recorded into history was the fact that Satella had a type of personality disorder. Not a standard split personality like how you or I tend to understand them though. This was more of a mental abnormality that was unique to witches. Satella had absorbed a witch factor that wasn't entirely compatible with her. This caused for an anomaly to occur within Satella's mind, which in turn created the personality of the Witch of Envy. 2 very distinct personas, and only one of which was ever recorded into history. So the witches didn't know whether the person in front of them was Satella or the Witch of Envy. That was why they couldn't attack her. The risk for Echidna was also far too great. Plus, it didn't help that she was the only witch that still had a desire to live. You see, all the others had already accepted their deaths. None of them saw the need to stay alive as lingering souls. To them, it was better to die while having lived according to their single belief than struggle to keep going. That was the nature of a witch. So it wasn't really all that bad if they disappeared along with Echidna's soul, which actually would have been what would happen if Echidna lost in battle. Anyway, Subaru initially showed a lot of hesitation when it came to the approaching shadow. He did have quite a few questions that he wanted answers to, but Minerva made it clear that the only way he was going to get them was by asking Satella directly. She personally felt that if Subaru couldn't even talk to someone who made such an effort to see him and him alone, then perhaps Subaru wasn't the man that she thought he was. Even so, Subaru wasn't about to do this just because Minerva said to. But that wasn't really helping the fact that the situation would stay as a stalemate until Subaru did do something. With the way it was, the fate of both himself and the witches now depended on the weakest and most foolish person among them. This was because Echidna's dream world was only kept in check by the witches who coexisted with each other. It was a balance carefully established between them and them alone. But that equilibrium was now in danger because of the appearance of this outsider. An outsider whose focus was set solely on Subaru, making him the only person capable of resolving this situation. So, not wanting to deal with any of this, Subaru first checked to see if Echidna would let him leave. Of course, her curiosity made her want to witness this encounter all the way to its end. Not to mention that since she just got dumped, she actually didn't mind getting to see another witch get that same treatment. So, with seemingly no options left, Subaru finally began to approach the Witch of Envy. The closer he got, the more his instincts were telling him to avert his eyes. It wasn't a reaction predicated out of fear though. It was more because this was something that Subaru didn't want to see. As Echidna herself likes to put it, everyone would prefer to avert their eyes from their most unsightly delusions. If you cannot see her face, the issue lies within your own mind. It was advice that urged Subaru to finally shift his head upward, and when he did, he found that it was neither hatred nor disgust that he felt towards this witch. No, that would have been much too easy. Instead, what he felt was a feeling of relief, reasons for which I'm sure you already know why. It's also the same reason that he couldn't stand to hear this person say, "I love you." These were words that he simply couldn't accept from her. Although they brought comfort to his soul, there was too much of a contradiction coming from his mind to allow that comfort to remain. Not only that, but the aura of obsession Subaru felt from the Witch of Envy now rivaled that of all the emotions that helped to keep him moving forward. It made Subaru feel as if all the memories he'd made and relationships he'd built were now at risk of being stripped away. That's just how much compulsion the witch seemed to have over him. So, out of the fear of that actually happening, Subaru had his outburst like how we saw in the anime, leading Minerva to express her grievances with it. She really didn't like Subaru's mentality of everything being okay simply because he was the only one who had to suffer. It was a mindset that she found to be unfair to the people around him, especially her. This was because this was a way of living that directly opposed her own. As a witch who vehemently opposes conflict, her wrath has always been intended to heal. So if she sees any form of harm being done, then she will always step in to fix it, self-harm included. That's why Subaru's disregard for his own life was something she simply couldn't allow. It went against everything that she stood for. That much was understandable. But what made Subaru lash out was her last comment about him being too cruel. To him, the way he was now was simply a natural result of all the events that he's been through. Events that several of the witches undoubtedly had their hands in. So for them to complain that the way Subaru turned out was unfair or just not right, well, then Subaru felt that the witches had no one to blame but themselves. One of the witches did interject to say that he could at least start to rely on others. But Subaru quickly refuted the idea since he felt he was the only one with the power to do anything. As he was now, he truly believed that his method of trial and error was the only way to make it to the future that he desired. This was the one and only thing that he found himself to be in agreement with the Witch of Greed. So, while still in a fit of rage, Subaru then went on to confront the Witch of Envy directly. He wanted to apologize for the time when he said that he was sick of her, reason being that that wasn't really true to how he actually felt. There was something that Subaru felt the need to show gratitude for. So, continuing with his aggressive tone, Subaru proceeded to thank the Witch of Envy for one thing and one thing only: the power to return by death. This was the only thing that he was willing to acknowledge her for, and when he did, he began to speak words that came from the deepest parts of his darkest emotions. But while rambling on and on about how he truly felt, one single word from Satella was enough to stop Subaru right in his tracks. Then this led to the several other words that went to make Subaru more confused than he's ever been before. You see, ever since he lost Rem, Subaru had forced himself to work alone. He didn't want to have to put anyone else at risk. So he forced himself to believe that no one would care what would happen to him. That was the only way that he could build the resolve to fight every single battle by himself. So for someone like Satella to come in and say that he should care more about himself, well, that was pretty much her denying his very way of living. She was slowly becoming this poison that was inching its way into Subaru's heart, one that was exposing each and every single one of his flaws, forcing him to come face to face with all the things that he had tried to bury deep within himself. Now, contrary to what Subaru believed, there were in fact people who could pass judgment over him. And that's exactly what Satella and the other witches were doing here, leading him to break down into tears like how we saw in the anime. When Tifon came to ask who it was that made him sad, she began to list out the names of the witches one by one. Minerva was the only suspect that she could really disregard though. I mean, her and all the other witches already knew that causing harm to others was impossible for her, which wasn't really something that she enjoyed being known for. So she chimed in to say that even she was capable of hurting others. But the way that she stuttered while saying it and the fact that her face always went pale whenever considering it, well, that was enough to show that Minerva wouldn't even hurt a fly. As Tifon continued with each of their names, Subaru could sense that the equilibrium existing between the witches was beginning to crumble. Tifon was closely inspecting each of the others to find out who it was that made Subaru cry. No matter who they were, punishment needed to be doled out to the person who had sinned. So here was Pride keen on punishing the sinners, while Wrath was trying to make sure that Satella's feelings would be heard. Sloth was observing everyone, waiting to strike down the first person that would make a move. Gluttony was simply watching for the opportunity where she could satiate her hunger. Then Greed was carefully taking in the encounter, paying close attention so that she could take note of any shifts in the balance of power. And last but not least, Satella was trying to comfort the boy in front of her. She spoke all these words of how Subaru had been this ray of light for her, how he had taken her hand and taught her all about the world, how he had given her all these things that saved her from her loneliness, all of which resulted in the manifestation of this undying affection towards him. To her, Subaru had given her everything. Of course, Subaru couldn't understand any of this. He'd never even met this girl before in his life. So to him, she was no different from Betelgeuse, a person who had simply gone mad with love. This was the conclusion that Subaru had come to. But for some reason, he couldn't force himself to feel the same way. The memories that Satella was trying to tie Subaru to were already latching themselves onto his heart. The single person that Subaru was supposed to hate the most in this world was now making him feel a way that never should have been possible. It made for an impossible contradiction that Subaru's mind simply couldn't handle. So, with nothing left but a desire to escape the current situation, Subaru did the only thing that he possibly could. Now, Subaru dying here bore a lot more risk than dying for real. Remember, dying here essentially meant the death of the mind, and the death of the mind had the potential to leave Subaru's body as an empty husk. So this could have very well led to a permanent end. Now, Minerva's attempt to stop this was actually quite the hypocritical act. Only moments ago she had just scolded Subaru for putting his own life on the line for what he desired. Yet here she was doing the exact same thing, disregarding her own existence so that she could take care of the conflict happening in front of her. Tifon deemed these actions to be sinful, which is why Minerva's arm began to shatter upon impact. When Satella began to tell him that he needed to start saving himself, her words reminded him of the vow that he once made to Rem. He began to wonder what Rem would think if she saw him as he was now. But that was a very dangerous thought to entertain. If he did, then it would directly oppose the belief that he could use his life as an expendable commodity. A belief that birthed from the idea that he simply wasn't a person that would be missed. When it came to the overall picture, Subaru saw his life as worthless. But was that a way of thinking that Rem would really be okay with? Subaru wasn't really sure. As his mind faded into the darkness and the voices of those closest to him began to ring in his ears, many more thoughts began to flood Subaru's head. He began to wonder if the people he was hearing would actually be sad about his death. Would they actually miss him if he left them behind? Was his life worth enough to them to make them feel some sort of distress about it? Subaru didn't know, so he wondered some more. Was it okay for him to think in such a conceited manner? Was it okay for someone like him to believe that other people needed him? Was he special enough to others to make them want to reach out their hand to save him? These were the thoughts that Subaru was now considering, all of which eventually led him to the final conclusion that had been in his heart all along. If it was okay for him to think that his life was valued enough by others, then Subaru wanted to be able to protect all their futures together, his included as well. So it was with that thought that Subaru was finally able to say that he didn't want to die. When he returned from the darkness and began to ask his questions out loud, Minerva was the first to respond by saying that she didn't have an answer. She did, however, know that Satella was one of those people that wanted him to live. Her plus all the other people who grieved for him in the second trial. You see, the second trial was never intended to show Subaru the sins that came from his mistakes. They weren't supposed to make him feel responsible for the worlds that were already gone. They were simply intended to show him the grief people felt because of the results of his mistakes. To show how people would cry for him, how they would lament over their own powerlessness to save him, how they would yearn for a future where he was still there by their side. That was the answer that Subaru should have come to. But up until now, those were thoughts that Subaru couldn't allow. That's why he kept needing to ask if it was okay to think like that, leading to Satella's acceptance of it like how we saw in the anime. Now, the fight that occurred while Subaru was coming to this realization was a little bit different. Unlike in the anime, Daphne had actually been released from the restraints of her coffin. She was personally facing off against Sekhmet while the coffin was used to take Tifon hostage. Because it wasn't a creature capable of being judged as a sinner, that made it the optimal weapon to take on Tifon. So, with Tifon now as Daphne's hostage, that put the strongest witch Sekhmet into a bind. Anything she would do would put Tifon's soul at risk, thus upsetting the equilibrium of Echidna's world. So that made Sekhmet unable to act. Now, the reason for Daphne's interference actually had a lot more depth to it. There was an innate curiosity that stemmed from being able to see Subaru find a way to beat the Great Rabbit. Because both the rabbit and herself shared the exact same hunger, Daphne felt that if Subaru could find a way to wipe them out, then that would be the same thing as solving her own hunger. An outcome that could potentially bring satisfaction to a witch that has never been satisfied. To know such a gratifying sense of content was certainly a dream that Daphne had never been able to attain. So perhaps she could grasp a portion of it if she were to see what was essentially her own hunger be brought to an end. It was a curiosity towards the unknown that rivaled even Echidna's. On the other hand, we know that Carmilla had used her faceless bride to bring to light all the voices that Subaru was hearing. This was because she had gained a bit of satisfaction from seeing Subaru deny Echidna in the previous episode. She also couldn't allow Subaru to disregard the love that was standing right in front of him, referring to her actions as some sort of debt that was being repaid. In any case, Subaru now found himself at a crossroads. With both his resolve and way of doing things now shattered into pieces, he wasn't so sure what it was he should be doing anymore, leading Echidna to make her request one last time, after which everything was pretty much the same. The only thing left worth noting was the veil that had disappeared from Satella's face. This wasn't something that had ever actually existed in the first place. The Satella we were seeing the entire time was the Satella that Subaru's mind had perceived. Subaru had been blocking out her face with a veil that was created from his own subconscious. Only after accepting Satella for who she was did that veil finally disappear, bringing us to the end of the Witch's Tea Party. So that was the halfway point of the episode. The next half leads us into events that brings us towards the climax of the arc. But rather than talk about it now and end it on a cliffhanger, I think it'd be better to save this half of the episode for a couple weeks before January. That way you can use it as a sort of recap for where we left off from today's episode. That being said, you're probably wondering what types of videos that I'm going to do next. Well, I know a lot of you are relatively new to the channel because of all the ReZero stuff. So I think it's only fair to tell you that my channel's content shifts with the seasons. Over the course of the next few months, instead of ReZero, I'll be focusing more on Danmachi and Mahoka. Not just cut contents, but also lore, magic system, and power level explanations. There will likely be one or two if stories in between all that. But ReZero won't be a main topic on my channel again until January. I do hope that you'll be able to stick around until then though. If not, then I still want you to know that I do appreciate all the support that I've received this season. Anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!